She's nothing but a waitress. My brother laughed, and the words landed heavier than the smoke from the grill. My father's booming chuckle followed, echoing through the backyard like a verdict. Plates clattered. Someone poured another drink, and I stood there with tongs in hand, pretending not to hear. They didn't know I'd spent the morning signing a deal worth more than everything in this house combined. They didn't know that the woman they mocked for refilling coffee cups was about to own half the city. But I smiled anyway, because I'd spent 5 years perfecting this recipe, and the first course was finally ready. The smell of grilled corn and smoked ribs filled the air as my family gathered around the patio table, basking in the warm glow of a Tennessee evening. The annual Reed family barbecue was in full swing, complete with laughter, gossip, and the quiet competition that always simmered beneath our so-called tradition. My father, Edward Reed, king of small-town construction contracts, sat at the head of the table, beer in hand, surrounded by the empire he believed he'd built. "Still at the coffee shop, huh, Sam?" my brother Ryan asked, his grin as predictable as the ticker tape on his watch. There it was, the opening jab. I turned from the grill, brushing a strand of hair off my cheek. "Yep," I said evenly. "Still there." Dad chuckled. "You've got to admire her consistency. Same apron, same paycheck. What's it been, 5 years now?" Laughter bounced off the patio walls. Even Mom smiled behind her wine glass, though it looked more like relief than amusement. It was the same smile she always wore when Dad was in one of his moods, when the safest thing to do was agree with him. "I like what I do," I said quietly, turning back to the burgers. The sizzle was louder than I remembered. Maybe it was just my pulse. Ryan leaned back in his chair. "Come on, Sam. You were valedictorian, remember? You could have been something big, not flipping lattes for minimum wage." He didn't notice the tremor in my hand as I placed another patty on the grill. "I'm working on something," I said. He snorted. "What latte art?" Dad's laughter joined his. "Don't be mean, Ryan. Maybe she'll open her own cafe someday. We'll all come by for a family discount." I forced a smile. "You'll have to book ahead." We get busy. The conversation moved on without me. Stocks, real estate, politics, the currency of the Reeds. I tuned them out, letting the chorus of pride and ego wash over me. I'd spent years perfecting this, the art of invisibility. Let them think I was nothing. That illusion had bought me the freedom to build everything. Behind me, the grill hissed a steady rhythm like a drumbeat. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced down. Marcus press release locked. CEO revealed in 2 hours. "Are you ready?" "Born ready," Sam Dad barked. I turned. He was holding up a plate burger half eaten. "You forgot to season this one. You used to have a better touch." "Sorry," I said, taking the plate. "Guess I'm rusty." He chuckled. "That's what happens when you stop striving. You get comfortable." Comfortable. If only he knew the sleepless nights, the endless spreadsheets, the silent war I'd fought building BrewLink, the tech-enabled coffee supply chain platform now valued at $5 billion. The same company his investment firm had tried and failed to acquire last year. The irony would hit soon enough. Ryan was now talking about his latest business trip to San Diego, where he'd closed a 7-figure deal. He caught my eye and smirked. "You know, Sam, you should meet someone from my team. They're always looking for baristas for corporate events." I almost laughed. "I'll keep that in mind." Mom cleared her throat. "Ryan, stop teasing your sister." Then she turned to me, her tone softer. "We just worry about you, honey. You're 30 now. Don't you want stability?" I bit the inside of my cheek. Stability? That's what they called a cubicle and a paycheck from Dad's company. "I'm stable, Mom," I said. "Just not in the way you define it." Dad was pouring himself another drink. "You know, I ran into your old professor last week. Asked what you were doing these days. I told him you were still finding yourself. He said it's a shame, said you had real potential." That stung more than I wanted to admit. But the next moment I heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel from the driveway. "Expecting someone?" Ryan asked. I shook my head. The conversation paused as the growl of an engine grew louder. A sleek black SUV pulled up beside the fence. Everyone turned. The car door opened, and out stepped Marcus Hale, my operations manager dressed in a sharp suit, every inch the executive. He walked straight toward the patio. "Who the hell is that?" Dad muttered. Marcus stopped beside me, ignoring the stunned faces around the table. He nodded respectfully. "Ma'am," he said, his tone formal. "Your board is waiting for you." Silence dropped like a heavy tablecloth, muffling the sounds of the Tennessee night. Dad's beer bottle slipped from his hand, landing in the grass with a dull thud. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed. What board?" he stammered. I smiled, finally turning to face them. "The one that runs the $5 billion company you tried to buy last year." Their faces went pale. Marcus gestured toward the SUV. "We have a video conference in 20 minutes, Ms. Reed. The international team's already online." "Thank you," I said calmly, handing him my apron. "I'll be right there." I turned back to my family. "You should eat before the food gets cold." "Sam." Dad started, his voice rough. "What are you talking about?" I met his eyes. "I'm talking about BrewLink, my company. The one I built while you all thought I was wasting my life." The color drained from his face. Ryan's voice cracked. That's impossible. BrewLink's worth billions. 5 to be exact." I slipped my phone into my bag. "But don't worry. I'll still make sure your favorite coffee brand stays stocked." I took one last look at the table, the perfect family tableau that had never made room for me, and smiled. Guess I finally learned how to season things right. Then I walked toward the SUV, leaving the smoke, the laughter, and the weight of their disbelief behind me. As Marcus opened the door, I glanced over my shoulder. My father stood frozen, the grill still burning behind him. Somewhere inside, the little girl who once begged for his approval finally went silent. The woman who replaced her smiled. Because tonight, for the first time, I didn't need their recognition. I had my own fire, and the world was about to taste it. The night after the barbecue, I couldn't sleep. The silence inside me was louder than the applause outside. My phone, however, was deafening. Notifications stacked like dominoes, news alerts, emails from investors, frantic messages from journalists. BrewLink CEO, revealed former waitress, Samantha Reed. Built a multi-billion-dollar empire in secret. My name was everywhere. The letters blurred, but the shock was physical, heavy beneath my ribcage. By morning, my inbox was a ticker tape of emergency, each bold subject line a tiny vibrating tremor in my hand. "Ryan." "What the hell is this, Dad?" "We need to talk, Mom. Sam, call me. Please." I didn't reply to any of them. I let their desperation sit unread, absorbing its metallic taste like a necessary vitamin. Instead, I slipped on jeans, tied my hair into a knot, and drove downtown. The streets of Nashville were waking up, coffee carts, steaming store signs flickering to life. As I passed the old Cedar Brew Cafe, the scent of roasted beans hit me like a memory. For years, this place had been my cover, my training ground, my safe house. The barista at the counter, one of the new hires, looked up, startled. "Ms. Reed, Samantha." I smiled. "Still just Sam here." She stammered something about how proud everyone was, how the story had gone viral overnight. I nodded, thanked her, and took my old seat by the window. The one where I'd spent countless nights drafting business models on napkins and fighting to keep the dream alive. It was strange how success could look so much like the same wooden table you started at. Marcus called. His voice, usually crisp, was taut with excitement. "Morning, boss. We've got interviews lined up, Forbes, Business Weekly, CNBC. You're trending #1 nationwide." I sipped my coffee. And the board ecstatic. They want a statement, something about resilience and the American dream. "Write it," I said, "but make sure it sounds real. No glitter." Marcus paused. "Your father's firm called the office. Let them wait." They didn't sound patient. Neither did they sound supportive for the last 10 years, I said. He hesitated, then chuckled softly. "Noted. By the way, the New York delegation confirmed next week." "Congratulations, Sam." You made it. Made it. The phrase hung in the air like steam from my cup. By noon, the world outside had shifted. Cameras parked across the street. Curious passers-by took photos through the cafe window trying to capture the woman who'd fooled everyone, including her own family. I'd spent years blending in, but now invisibility was no longer an option. A familiar black SUV pulled up outside. Marcus stepped out. Even in the Tennessee heat, his suit was sharp enough to cut glass, his expression shielded by dark lenses. He walked in and handed me a tablet. "Press coverage is insane," he said. "You've become the face of self-made America." I glanced through the articles, my name tied to every possible label, genius, fraud, rebel, icon. "They love you," Marcus said. "They love the story," I corrected. "Not me." He sat down across from me. "You know, most people would kill for this kind of recognition." "Most people didn't earn it in silence," I said. Marcus leaned back, studying me. "You've been building this thing for 4 years. You should enjoy it." "I will," I said, "once the noise fades." He hesitated before lowering his voice. "Ryan's office left 3 messages with our legal team. They're trying to verify your ownership stake." I almost laughed. "Of course they are. Should we respond? No. Let them dig. They'll find out soon enough that Brewlink bought out Reed Capital's pending shares last quarter." Marcus grinned. "You're ruthless." "I'm precise," I said. "There's a difference." That evening I returned home to a flood of missed calls. My voicemail was full. I played one dad's voice, low and unfamiliar. "Sam, it's your father. We need to meet. This isn't how a family should operate. Call me back." Family. The word no longer fits the same way it used to. I set the phone down and walked to the window. The city skyline glowed gold and steel, my skyline now. The headquarters of Brewlink stood tall among the towers, its glass facade catching the last light of sunset. It was the only monument I had ever needed. The structure stood taller than their expectations. I had nothing left to pour in, only results to show. My reflection in the window stared back, strong, composed, a stranger who had finally outgrown the version everyone once pitied. I whispered to her, "You're allowed to be proud now." 2 days later, I walked into Brewlink headquarters for the first time since the reveal. The lobby buzzed with energy journalists, hovering employees, whispering flashes of camera light bouncing off marble walls. A young intern at the front desk looked up, eyes wide. "Ms. Reed, thank you for showing us that where you start doesn't decide where you end up." I touched her shoulder gently. "That's exactly the point," I agreed, moving toward the elevator. Upstairs, the boardroom waited. The same board that had doubted my anonymity now stood when I entered. Marcus gave me a small nod. "Welcome back, CEO." As I took my seat, I saw the reflection of the skyline behind me in the glass wall, a perfect mirror of where I'd come from and where I was going. I cleared my throat. Let's get to work. That night I met Ava at Cedar Brew. She'd been my anchor through it all, the one friend who never cared about titles or shares. She grinned when I walked in. "So Ms. Billionaire, does this mean I finally get free coffee for life?" I laughed. "Only if you brew it yourself." We sat by the window, the same spot as always. Outside, the city pulsed with energy, but inside it was quiet, warm. "Do you ever think about them?" Ava asked softly. "My family." "Yeah." I looked down at my cup. "Every day. But not the way I used to." Ava studied me. "You're not done with them, are you?" I shook my head. "No. Revenge isn't about ending something. It's about rewriting it." She raised an eyebrow. "And what's next in your rewrite?" I smiled faintly. "A meeting. Family meeting, something like that." Outside, a storm was building in the distance. Thunder rolling, low, steady, inevitable. I finished my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my hands. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, "they'll learn what family looks like when you finally stop asking for a seat at their table and start owning the whole damn house." Ava grinned. "Now that's the Sam I know." I smiled back, the weight in my chest replaced by something cleaner, lighter. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving anymore. I was ready. and the world finally was going to hear me. By the time I joined Reed Capital, I'd already learned how to disappear in plain sight. I walked those hallways with my head down, armed with spreadsheets, and silence pretending to fit into a world that treated my existence like a clerical error. The building smelled like ambition, a scent polished so thin it almost hid the underlying anxiety trapped in the air. My nameplate read Samantha Reed, Junior Analyst, but everyone knew what I really was, the boss's daughter, who'd somehow ended up with a desk no one wanted and responsibilities that barely mattered. Experience, my father called it. Punishment, I called it quietly. Ryan strutted past my cubicle that first week, coffee in hand, tie loose in that effortless way he knew looked expensive. "Don't forget to grab the partner's lunch orders, Sam," he said without looking at me. "You're good at remembering details, right?" I swallowed my pride, grabbed the pad. Power here wasn't spoken, it was implied in the weight of the notepad itself. Every smirk, every helpful suggestion, every joke about the family intern was just another reminder that no matter how much I knew, I'd never belong. I told myself it was temporary, that I was collecting information, learning how the system worked from the inside out. But some nights when the office emptied and I was still typing reports no one would read, I wondered if I was just lying to myself. The meeting that changed everything happened on a Monday morning, the kind of day when the city felt heavy, the air too thick to breathe. I'd spent the weekend finalizing a proposal, a small project on digital payment solutions for local cafes. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was mine. When I walked into the conference room, my father was already seated at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone. Ryan sat beside him, laughing with two senior partners. I took my place quietly at the end of the long oak table, my fingers digging into the folder like I was holding the whole idea from drowning. "We'll start with quarterly updates," Dad said without glancing up. "Ryan." My brother launched into a detailed presentation about a real estate venture in Dallas, numbers, charts, projections. The partners nodded approvingly. When he finished, the room buzzed with polite applause. Then my father's gaze flicked to me. "Samantha, anything to add?" I took a deep breath. "Yes. I've been researching a potential market expansion, an online platform that connects local coffee shops directly to distributors. It's low-cost, scalable, and could diversify our portfolio." Ryan snorted. "We're not in the coffee business." "Maybe we should be," I said, meeting his eyes. "The beverage industry's projected growth," Dad's voice cut through mine like a gavel. "This firm deals in assets and returns, not cappuccinos." Laughter rippled across the table. My cheeks burned. I tried again. "It's not about coffee, Dad. It's about connection-building infrastructure for small businesses." He raised a hand. "Enough. Let's stay focused on real investments. Real investments. As if the years of data I'd analyzed, the nights spent refining that model, weren't real enough." The meeting ended, chairs scraping against the floor, papers shuffling. My folder sat unopened in front of me. When the room emptied, I stayed seated, staring at it until the letters blurred. Ryan lingered at the door. "Don't take it personally, Sam. Not everyone's meant to lead." I didn't look up. "And some people mistake inheritance for leadership." His smile faltered. For once I saw something flicker behind his confidence sphere, maybe. Then he turned and left. That evening, the office lights dimmed, leaving only the glow from the city outside. I sat at my desk, staring at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. My proposal file still blinked on the monitor. The humiliation from that meeting was an unhealable wound. It became a haunting memory I couldn't escape whenever I thought of my family, like a beautiful dream that vanished into the cold, dark night. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here. But as I stared out the window, something shifted. Across the street, I could see the reflection of the Reed Capital logo glowing faintly against the glass. And beneath it, a coffee shop, its lights warm, its door swinging open to the rhythm of real life. That's when it hit me. I'd been fighting for a seat at their table when I could build my own. I opened a new document, titled Digital Brew Network. Hours passed unnoticed. The office grew quiet, the hum of the city fading into the background. I outlined, calculated, designed. This wasn't just a project anymore, it was a blueprint for escape. By the time dawn broke over Nashville, my resignation letter sat neatly typed beside my keyboard. Ryan found me the next morning still at my desk. "Did you sleep here?" "Didn't need to," I said. "I was working." He noticed the letter. "You're quitting. I'm starting something," I corrected. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think you can survive out there on your own, without Dad's name?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Watch me." He shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Sam." "Probably," I said. "But at least it'll be mine." When he left, I gathered my things, a few notebooks, a pen, a mug that read, "World's Okayest Analyst." Before walking out, I stopped by my father's office. He was on the phone, waving at me impatiently. "Make it quick," he said. I set a paper cup on his desk. Steam rose from the coffee inside. "Just thought you'd like one last taste before I go." He frowned. "Go where anywhere but here." He opened his mouth, but I was already gone. Outside, the city was waking up again. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the reflection of Reed Capitol fade behind me. The air smelled like rain. I should have been scared, but all I felt was clarity. For years, I'd let them define success as skyscrapers and suits. Now I understood success was freedom. I walked 2 blocks and stopped in front of a small shop with a hand-painted sign, Cedar Brew Cafe. Ava stood inside, wiping down the counter. She looked up surprised. "Sam, what are you doing here? Don't tell me you finally quit that place." I smiled for the first time that day. "Got room for one more?" Ava grinned. "Always." She tossed me an apron. The fabric still smelled faintly of espresso and hope. As I tied it around my waist, I felt something settle inside me, not defeat, but relief. That day, I stopped chasing their approval and started building my own future, one cup, one idea, one defiant breath at a time. The first time I burned a latte at Cedar Brew, the machine's angry hiss felt like a personal critique. It sputtered and spewed milk across the counter like it was personally offended by my ambition. Ava laughed so hard she nearly dropped the scones. "Relax, Sam," she said, wiping the counter. The damp cloth was cool against my burning palm. "It's just foam, not failure." Easy for her to say. She'd been running this cafe for years, juggling invoices, suppliers, and caffeine-deprived customers with the grace of a circus performer. I was the new girl, the ex-corporate daughter who didn't know the difference between a macchiato and a meltdown. But I learned fast. The cafe opened at 6 every morning, and by 5:30 I was already there, sweeping the floors, checking the till, prepping beans that smelled like home. The temperature was always a deep, quiet chill before the machines kicked on. By 7, the first rush would hit truck drivers, nurses coming off night shifts, bleary-eyed college students clutching laptops. I served them all with a smile that slowly started to feel real. Each cup I poured became something sacred, an act of quiet defiance. Every tip was a tiny victory. Every satisfied customer a reminder that I could build something meaningful without anyone's approval. Cedar Brew wasn't glamorous, but it was alive. The regulars became part of my world. Mr. Harlan, the retired mechanic who tipped in quarters and always said, "Best damn coffee south of Memphis." The local high school teacher who graded papers in the corner. The band kids who'd pool their change for one large mocha, their energy louder than the brass they'd just packed away. They didn't care about my last name. They didn't ask about my resume. They just wanted warmth, caffeine, and a place to belong. That's what I loved most. It was real. Ava caught me one afternoon scribbling notes on the back of an order slip between customers. "What are you plotting?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing," I said too quickly. She snatched the slip and read it aloud. "Direct supplier chain, digital ordering system, real-time bean tracking." "Sam, this is not nothing." I smiled sheepishly. "Just an idea." Ava leaned on the counter. "You know you talk like a businesswoman even when you're steaming milk." Force of habit. "Are you still thinking about that company you wanted to start? The one your dad hated every day?" Ava nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe stop thinking and start doing." The idea never left me. At night after closing, I'd sit in the corner booth with my laptop surrounded by the smell of roasted beans and quiet. I started designing again this time without permission, without an audience, without anyone's expectations. The name came easily, BrewLink, a digital bridge connecting small cafes directly to coffee growers and distributors. No middlemen, no exploitation, no overpriced markup. It wasn't just a business model, it was a rebellion disguised as innovation. The first person I told was Ava. "You're insane," she said, but in a good way. "I need suppliers, coders, investors," I said, pacing the floor. Ava smirked. "And sleep. You need sleep," I grinned. "Sleep's for people who haven't spent their whole lives waiting for revenge." She threw a dish towel at me. "You're hopeless." But she stayed up with me anyway, testing the prototype, checking supplier data, proofreading my investor pitch deck. We worked until sunrise. The cafe lights reflected off our coffee cups like a promise neither of us wanted to break. By the second year, BrewLink had its first 2 pilot cafes, one in Austin, one in Chattanooga. Small, scrappy, independent. Just like me. The system was basic, but it worked. Orders were faster profits. Fairer farmers paid directly. I remember the day the first invoice cleared. I looked at my bank account, saw the deposit, and laughed so hard, Ava thought I'd lost it. "Why are you crying?" she asked, handing me a napkin. "I'm not crying," I said. She grinned. "Caffeinated beyond reason proof," I finished. "Proof that I don't need them to be right." But even success cast a recognizable shadow. Every milestone came with whispers from my old life. Reed Capital analysts started sniffing around local cafes asking questions. My father's contacts called mutual investors trying to figure out who was behind the anonymous platform disrupting their distribution channels. They didn't suspect me, not yet. I was still the forgotten Reed. The waitress who'd disappeared into obscurity. Good. Let them laugh. It gave me time. One night Marcus called. He'd been a junior consultant at Reed Capital, back in the day one of the few who treated me like a person, not a liability. "I heard what you're building," he said. "You're flying under radar, but not for long." They're connecting dots. "How much time do I have?" 6 months, maybe less. I leaned back, staring at the flickering cafe sign outside. "Then I'll need to move faster." "You'll need protection," he said. "And funding." "I'll take both," I said. Marcus chuckled. "You sound like a CEO already." By year 3, BrewLink had offices tiny, cluttered alive with energy. Ava ran logistics, Marcus handled legal, and I did everything else. I didn't have a corner office or a chauffeur. I had caffeine conviction and a mission. We'd built something real, something no one could take credit for but us. Still on quiet nights when the cafe was empty and the city slept, I'd catch myself staring at the reflection in the window. The name Reed still haunted me, carved into the skyscraper downtown, glowing like an accusation. They thought I'd vanished. They thought I was nothing. And for once I didn't mind. Because sometimes to build your own empire you have to stay hidden until your fire is hot enough to incinerate the old one. Ava leaned against the counter one night as we closed. "Have you ever thought about going back? Showing them what you've done?" I smiled, wiping down the espresso machine. "Not yet." "When then? When they ask if I still work at the coffee shop?" Ava laughed, shaking her head. "You're dangerous, Sam." "No," I said softly, glancing out at the glowing sign that read Cedar Brew. "I'm just getting started. This place wasn't my cover anymore. It was my beginning." The rain had just started when my phone buzzed, a private number, the kind that only meant trouble. I almost didn't answer. It was past midnight, and the cafe held the low electric silence that follows a long day's work. "Sam." The voice was unmistakable. My mother. Smooth, careful, too calm. "Your father wants you to come home. There's a family gathering this weekend. Everyone will be there." I froze. I hadn't spoken to them in nearly 3 years. Why, I asked, finally. "Is someone dying?" A soft laugh, nervous. "Don't be dramatic. It's just, your father's turning 60. He wants everyone together again. Even Ryan. Even Ryan." That was code for "this is not optional." I looked at the empty cafe, the faint glow of the BrewLink logo flickering across my laptop screen. My life now was built far away from theirs, filled with people who knew me for what I'd done, not where I'd come from. But somewhere deep down, I knew this day would come. "Fine," I said. "I'll come." "Wonderful," she said quickly, as if afraid I'd change my mind. "It's at the house. Saturday. Dinner at 6. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the rain running down the windows. I thought about the last time I'd been home, the shouting, the slammed doors, my father's voice telling me I'd never survive outside his shadow. I had survived. And now I was ready to walk into that house not as the forgotten daughter, but as someone who had built an empire from the ground up. The drive to my parents' estate was longer than I remembered. The city faded into rolling hills, then into gated communities where everything looked expensive and empty. The Reeds didn't just live in comfort, they lived in control. When I pulled up to the long curved driveway, my brother's black BMW was already there, gleaming under the porch light, announcing his success with unnecessary volume. The butler opened the door with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Reed. Welcome home." Miss Reed. I hadn't heard that in years. The house smelled the same polished wood, expensive candles, and the lingering scent of old money trying too hard to seem new. My mother appeared in the foyer, dressed impeccably as always, her hair untouched by time. "Darling," she kissed the air near my cheek. "You look different." "I am different." She hesitated, then smiled tightly. "Of course. Let's not keep your father waiting." The dining room was full of laughter when I entered, the kind that didn't quite sound human. My father sat at the head of the table, his presence as heavy as ever. Ryan was beside him, mid-story, the golden child still basking in his own spotlight. "And the investors loved it," Ryan was saying. "We're expanding into international properties next quarter." Dad nodded proudly. "That's what I like to hear. Real initiative." Then he looked up and saw me. The warmth in his expression drained instantly, leaving a professional blankness behind. "Samantha." "Dad." For a second, silence. Then Ryan leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Look who decided to come out of hiding." "Ryan?" My mother warned, her tone sharp. "It's fine," I said calmly, taking a seat. "I've been busy working." "At the coffee shop," he said, feigning innocence. "Among other places." He chuckled. "Still playing barista?" "You know, most people outgrow that in college." I smiled faintly. "Most people stop relying on Daddy's money by then, too." The table went quiet. My father's eyes hardened. "We didn't invite you here to start another argument." "Then why did you?" I asked. "To remind you that family still matters," he said evenly, "no matter how far you've strayed." "I didn't stray, Dad. I built my own path." Ryan laughed. "Oh, right, the path of lattes and life lessons. It must be exhausting." I met his gaze. At least my path didn't come pre-paved. His smirk faltered, but before he could respond, the housekeeper entered, whispering something to my father. He frowned, then nodded. "The projector's ready," he said. "Ryan's presentation." "Of course. A family dinner disguised as a corporate showcase." Ryan stood and dimmed the lights. The screen lit up with glossy slides, graphs, towers, luxury developments. "Reed Capital's next big venture," he said proudly. "The future of our family name." The words "family name" hung heavy in the air. I almost laughed. When the lights came back on, everyone clapped except me. "Impressive," I said softly. "Almost makes you forget the debt behind it." Ryan's smile snapped. "Excuse me? Your Dallas project," I said, folding my hands. "You're leveraged at 78%, and your liquidity buffer's been burned by 3 bad acquisitions. Am I wrong?" His jaw clenched. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Actually," I said, "I do. BrewLink's analytics flagged your suppliers 3 months ago. You're bleeding cash, Ryan." My father's face turned red. "Enough." But I wasn't done. "You're so busy building towers you never looked at the cracks in your own foundation." Ryan stood abruptly, knocking over his glass. "Who do you think you are?" I stood too, my voice calm. "Someone who stopped asking for permission." The silence that followed was heavy. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for her napkin. My father looked at me with the stunned, wide-eyed gaze of a man who realized he no longer controlled the narrative. "Leave," he said finally. "If you're going to insult this family, you can do it from the outside." I nodded. "That's where I've always been." As I turned to go, Ryan muttered under his breath, "Still at the coffee shop, huh?" I stopped at the doorway. "For now." Then I smiled. "But soon you'll be buying your coffee from me." The night air outside was sharp and clean. My car engine hummed quietly as I drove away, the mansion shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was nothing but a shadow. My phone buzzed a message from Marcus. Marcus press release drafted. Phoenix Consolidated ready to go. Live. Me, do it. I looked at the clock. Midnight again. By the time they woke up tomorrow, the news would break. Phoenix Consolidated parent company of Brewlink had just finalized its latest round of acquisitions, including Reed Capital's Dallas assets. The rain started again as I drove soft and steady against the windshield. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small walking away from them. I felt like the storm. The morning light hit my office windows like a spotlight streaking across the city skyline that used to belong to them. I sat behind my desk glass, simple, unbranded, watching the first notifications roll in. The press release had gone live exactly at 8 o'clock. Phoenix Consolidated finalizes acquisition of Reed Capital's Dallas holdings. The first article was cautious. The second was louder. By the third, it had gone viral. Samantha Reed, former corporate dropout, ex-waitress founder and CEO of Phoenix Consolidated. The story everyone thought they knew had been rewritten in real time. Marcus appeared at my door, 2 phones in his hand and an unreadable grin on his face. "You're officially the most searched name in business media." I sipped my coffee. "They'll get bored in a week." He laughed. "Not this time. Your father just canceled his morning press briefing. Ryan's been dodging reporters since dawn. Their PR team is actively dissolving." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city below. Good. Maybe it's time they got used to the heat. By noon, the calls started. My mother first, then my father, then Ryan. I didn't answer any of them. Marcus raised an eyebrow as my phone buzzed again. "You're not even curious what they want to say." "I already know," I said. "They'll pretend it's not personal. They'll say it's business. But I'll remind them business was personal all along." The elevator chimed and Ava stepped in, still wearing her cedar brew apron. She looked out of place amid the glass walls and chrome fixtures. "Your assistant tried to stop me," she said. "I told her I taught you how to make coffee." She let me through. I stood and hugged her tightly. "You shouldn't have come all the way downtown." "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this for the world." She grinned, eyes sparkling. "They're talking about you on every channel." The waitress turned mogul. The woman who outplayed her own family. I shook my head. They make it sound like a soap opera, reducing years of strategy to a headline. "Well," she said, shrugging, "you do have better lighting now." We laughed, but beneath the humor there was something heavier, a truth neither of us could ignore. I hadn't just changed my life. I'd changed the balance of power in theirs. At 1 o'clock, the receptionist buzzed. "Ms. Reed, your father and brother are here." "They don't have an appointment." Ava raised her eyebrows. "Showtime." I exhaled slowly. Showtime. When they entered, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father walked in first, composed, precise, his anger buried under that old veneer of control. Ryan followed, eyes dark, jaw set. "This is quite the stunt," my father said without sitting down. "No stunt," I replied evenly. "Just business. You deliberately targeted our holdings. I acquired assets your firm couldn't manage," I corrected. "You were over-leveraged. I did you a favor." Ryan slammed his hand on my desk. The sound was loud, but it only proved he had lost the argument. "You humiliated us in front of every investor in the country," I met his glare. "You did that yourselves the moment you underestimated me." For a long moment, no one spoke. My father finally sat down, folding his hands. "You've made your point, Samantha. You've proven yourself. Now let's talk about moving forward. We can merge. Combine resources. Strengthen the family name. The family name, I repeated, laughing softly. The same one that told me I wasn't good enough to sit at your table. His jaw tightened. You're being emotional. No, I said quietly. I'm being factual. I turned the laptop toward him. On the screen was the list of acquisitions: BrewLink, Phoenix Consolidated, Cedar Brew, half a dozen startups we'd absorbed in the past year. Beneath it, a bold valuation number glowed: $5.2 billion. That's my company, I said. Not Reed Capital. Not the Reeds. Mine. Ryan scoffed. You think this makes you powerful? You got lucky, Sam. You rode a trend. The next market shift will swallow you whole. Maybe, I said, but at least I built my own wave. His face reddened. You're still the same reckless, self-righteous naive, and you're still small enough to measure worth by last names. My father rose. We're done here. Yes, I said. We are. He turned to leave, but I stopped him. Oh, and Dad. One more thing. The Dallas headquarters lease expires next quarter. I'll be taking over the building. Make sure your team clears out by then. Ryan spun around. You can't. I said, cutting him off. I already did. They left without another word. The elevator doors closed with a hiss that felt final. Ava let out a low whistle. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Marcus chuckled. They won't know what hit them. I settled deeper into the chair, feeling the weight of the moment lift from my shoulders. Power didn't feel like victory. It felt heavy earned, but costly. That evening I walked back to Cedar Brew. The neon sign buzzed faintly above the door, the same one I'd stared at during my lowest nights. Inside, the smell of roasted beans wrapped around me like an old friend. Betty, the night barista, waved. Hey, boss. You hear the news? Some hotshot company bought out Reed Capital's assets. You should have seen their faces on TV. I smiled. Yeah, I caught that. Crazy world, she said, shaking her head. I wish I could meet the woman who pulled that off. You just did. She froze, eyes wide. Wait, you... Let's keep that between us, I said gently. Betty grinned. Your secret's safe. But damn, Sam, you really did it, didn't you? I looked around the small cafe, the worn chairs, the humming espresso machine, the quiet hum of belonging. Not yet, I said, but I'm getting there. Later, as I locked the doors and stepped outside, the city lights flickered against the wet pavement. My phone buzzed again, another missed call from my mother. I let it ring this time, watching it glow in my hand until it went dark. Then I whispered to the night, almost to myself, they called me a waitress. They were right. I smiled. I just happened to serve consequences now. The first headline landed with the weight of a bad prophecy. Reed Capital faces internal turmoil following major asset loss. The next morning, another one followed. Insiders report leadership rift between father and son. By the end of the week, the story had spread from financial blogs to national news. I didn't have to gloat. The universe was doing that for me. Marcus slid a tablet across my desk, his satisfaction contained to a subtle tightening around his eyes. It's happening faster than we predicted. Investors are pulling out. Their liquidity just cratered. I skimmed the screen numbers, bleeding red charts collapsing like dominoes. They'll blame each other before the week's over. He smiled. They already have. Outside my window, the skyline shimmered under the noon sun. Somewhere in those towers, my brother was pacing a boardroom, trying to explain how he lost half their empire to the sister they'd written off. I took a slow sip of coffee, the taste warm and grounding. Let it play out. Don't intervene. The market has a way of teaching lessons I never could. 3 days later, my phone buzzed again. Ryan. I ignored the first 2 calls, then finally answered the third. Sam, he said, his voice clipped but desperate. We need to talk. I'm listening. You've made your point. You've humiliated us publicly. Are you happy now? Happy? I leaned back in my chair. That's not the word I'd use. Then what do you want? Money control. Dad said we can renegotiate. I don't want your money, Ryan. I never did. I wanted respect. There was a pause on the line. "You can't buy that," he said finally. "No," I agreed softly. "That's why you never had it." He exhaled sharply. "You're destroying everything. You don't understand what's at stake." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said. "You built your world on arrogance. I built mine on failure. Guess which one lasts longer?" He hung up. I stared at the silent phone for a long moment, then whispered to the empty office. "You should have taken me seriously when I was still asking." That weekend, the storm hit. A leaked internal memo revealed mismanagement at Reed Capital, overspending risky loans, falsified projections. It was brutal. By Monday morning, their stock had plummeted 22%. Meanwhile, in a sharp contrast of fortunes, Phoenix Consolidated announced a partnership with the state's renewable energy initiative. The timing was no coincidence. Ava burst into my office, waving her phone. "You've officially replaced your brother as the media's favorite read." "A title I'll hold with ironic grace," I said. "Still," she said, leaning against the desk, "it's poetic. They used to laugh at you for pouring coffee. Now you're pouring capital." I laughed softly. Funny how things come full circle. Marcus entered then carrying 2 cups. "And in case you forgot what started all this," he said, handing me one. "Straight from Cedar Brew." The smell hit me first, rich, familiar grounding. I took a sip and closed my eyes. "Still the best. Always will be," he said. "By the way, you've been invited to the Business Visionary Awards next month." "Guess who's on the committee?" I opened one eye. "Don't say it," your father Marcus said with a grin. That night I couldn't sleep. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of my apartment, looking down at the city. The lights shimmered like constellations, each one a distant prize that offered no warmth when held. Power, recognition, revenge. They all felt hollow once you had them. My phone buzzed again. A message from my mother. "Please come to dinner. No reporters. Just family." For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then, for reasons I couldn't name, I typed back, "Tomorrow at 7. The next evening, the Reed family dining room looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe I'd just grown too big for it. My father was already seated, shoulders heavier, lines deeper. My mother gave a fragile smile. Ryan didn't look up from his plate. "Thank you for coming," my father said finally. "Let's skip the formalities," I said. "What do you want?" He sighed. "I want to understand how you did it." I tilted my head. "How I took what you never thought I could." He nodded slowly. "Yes." I studied him for a long moment. "I started by listening to people you ignored. Baristas, drivers, farmers, the ones who make the world move while you pretend to control it." Ryan scoffed. "Spare us the sermon." I met his glare. "You know what the difference is between us? You think success is a birthright. I think it's borrowed time." He pushed back from the table. "This is pointless." My father didn't stop him. "Ryan," he said quietly, "sit down." It was the first time I'd ever heard uncertainty in his voice. When Ryan left, the silence that followed was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "You've changed," my father said softly. "No," I said. "I finally became the person you told me I couldn't be." He nodded, eyes distant. "Maybe that's what frightens me." When I walked out of that house, the night air felt different. Not like victory, not like revenge. Something deeper. A quiet peace that came from knowing I didn't need their apology to move forward. At the end of the driveway, I turned back once. The mansion windows glowed faintly against the dark, fragile, like old glass trying to hold back a storm. I whispered to the wind, "You built your empire on pride. I built mine on purpose. Only one of those foundations can bear the weight of a storm." Then I got in my car, started the engine, and drove toward the city lights, my skyline, my world, my beginning. By the time the second wave of headlines hit, the story had turned brutal. Reed Capital implodes. Amid allegations of fraud. Ryan Reed under federal investigation for misreporting assets. Every major outlet carried the same photo Ryan. Stepping out of a courthouse, jaw tight, eyes dark with fatigue. his tie always the symbol of his control crooked for the first time. I watched the news from the quiet of my office, a cup of black coffee on the cool glass desk. This wasn't the victory I'd imagined. It was just fallout. "Guess karma's punctual this year," Ava said, stepping inside with a half-hearted grin. I set the cup down. This isn't triumph. This is the collapse of a structure built on arrogance. That night the messages poured in again, reporters asking for comments, investors offering congratulations, former Reed employees sending quiet thank yous. I didn't respond to any of them. But one message stood out. My mother. "Your father hasn't been sleeping. Ryan's company accounts have been frozen. We need help, Samantha." It wasn't guilt I felt, but something heavier, an ache that was the exact measure of every slight I'd endured. For years they'd made me feel invisible. Now they were drowning in the light I'd built. Marcus found me staring out the window again, arms folded. "You saw the reports." I nodded. "It's worse than I thought. Ryan made bad calls," he said. "Over-leveraged, undersecured. You warned them. Warnings don't matter to people who mistake altitude for invincibility." He hesitated. "You're not thinking of helping them, are you?" I didn't answer right away. "I'm thinking of what happens when an empire built on arrogance finally burns down." Marcus studied me for a moment. "Then you'd better decide whether you're watching the fire or walking through it." The next morning I walked into my boardroom to find the air buzzing with excitement. Screens around the room flashed market updates. Phoenix consolidated stock had surged another 20%. Investors were calling us a model of sustainable power. "Congratulations, Sam," one of my directors said. "You've officially outperformed every Reed Capital valuation in history." The applause that followed felt hollow. I nodded, thanked them, and ended the meeting early. When everyone left, I stayed seated staring at the logo etched on the glass wall, Phoenix Consolidated. A company built from ashes. But whose ashes were they now? That afternoon, I drove to Cedar Brew. It had become my sanctuary again, the only place untouched by wealth or ego. Betty was there wiping down the counter with her usual slow rhythm. "Long day?" she asked. "The longest," I said, sitting at the bar. She poured me a cup without asking. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one people get right before they make a choice that erases their map." I smiled faintly. "Maybe both." The doorbell chimed, and for a second I thought I imagined it. But then I saw him, Ryan. He looked smaller, older. The confident tilt of his shoulders was gone. His suit hung looser than it used to. "Sam," he said quietly. "Ryan?" He glanced around, clearly out of place among the mismatched chairs and the smell of cinnamon and espresso. "Can we talk?" I nodded to a booth in the corner. He sat across from me, hands clasped tightly together. For the first time I noticed they were trembling. "I'm not here to fight," he said. I need to understand. Understand how you did it. How you built all this while I was..." He stopped himself. "While we were looking down on you." I looked at him carefully. "You build differently when no one's watching. You learn to fight smarter, not louder." He nodded slowly. "I used to think power was about control, about always being right. And now," he gave a tired smile, "now I think it's about surviving your own mistakes." For a moment neither of us spoke. The sound of the espresso machine filled the silence between us like static. Finally he said, "Dad's in trouble, Sam. Financially. Emotionally. He won't admit it, but he's broken. The firm is gone. The house is half mortgaged. Mom's selling her jewelry." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice even. "You're telling me this because you think I can fix it." "I'm telling you this because I don't know what else to do." I leaned back. "You know, once upon a time you told me I'd never make it. That I'd end up serving coffee until I was 40. He winced. "I remember. And here we are," I said softly. "You in my cafe asking for mercy." He didn't look away. "I'm not asking for mercy. I'm asking for a family." That word hit harder than I expected. Family. For a long time, it had been the wound I couldn't stop touching. But now hearing it from him didn't sting, it just echoed hollow and distant. I folded my hands. Family is earned, Ryan. You don't get to claim it only when you're falling. I know, he said. But I'm trying. Something inside me shifted just slightly. The part of me that had spent years burning bridges now hesitated at the edge of the flames. I'll think about it, I said finally. He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. That's all I can ask. As he stood to leave, Betty passed by, refilling my cup. You two okay? She asked after he walked out. I don't know, I said. But maybe that's a start. That night I stayed long after closing the cafe dark, except for the glow of the city outside. For years, revenge had been my compass. But now that I'd reached the destination, I couldn't tell if I'd won or just outlasted everyone else. My phone buzzed again, a message from Marcus. Press wants your comment on the Reed Capital collapse. What should I tell them? I stared at the screen for a long time before typing back. Tell them no comment. Some lessons speak louder in silence. I set the phone down, exhaled, and whispered to the empty cafe. Let it burn. But not us. Then I poured myself one last cup of coffee, strong, bitter, and honest. It tasted like the silence after a lifetime of noise. The knock came too early for anything but bad news. It was the kind of sound you learn to dread in your quietest moments. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when the sound echoed through the quiet of my apartment. Sharp, hesitant, familiar. When I opened the door, I found my father standing there. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. The heavy weight of his former control had simply evaporated. His tailored coat was damp from the drizzle outside, his silver hair slightly out of place. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside without a word. He glanced around my apartment as though cataloging it, minimal, practical, nothing like the marble halls he was used to. The smell of coffee lingered between us, grounding and human. You've done well, he said finally. I know. He gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I suppose I deserve that. You deserve a lot more than that, I said quietly. He took a slow breath, lowering himself onto the couch. I'm not here to argue, Samantha. I've done enough of that for one lifetime. Then why are you here? He looked down at his hands the way people do when they're trying to find courage in their palms. Because I finally see what I refused to before. I folded my arms. Which part? The part where you dismissed me or the part where I proved you wrong? Both, he said simply. The silence that followed was dense and humid, pressing the unsaid things between us. He finally spoke. When the firm collapsed, I thought I'd lost everything. But the truth is, I lost you long before that. Somewhere between trying to shape you into my idea of success and watching you resist it. I didn't move. You didn't lose me, Dad. You pushed me away. He nodded. And you built something stronger than anything I could have imagined. I read the articles you know. About BrewLink. About Phoenix. About how you've changed the market. I said nothing. You built your empire the way I should have built mine, he said. From the ground up. With people, not power. Funny, I said, leaning against the table. I learned that from pouring coffee. He chuckled softly. Maybe that's what I needed to pour a few cups myself. For the first time in years, I saw something genuine in his eyes. Humility. It was real, and it was the most strategic thing he had ever done. I came here, he continued, because I want to understand you. Not as a businessman, as your father. The words hit harder than I expected. For a long time, I'd fantasized about this moment. The apology, the recognition, the simple acknowledgement that I mattered. Now that it was here, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Understanding me doesn't undo what happened, I said finally. I know. But it might stop me from repeating it. He hesitated. Would you let me see what you've built, BrewLink Phoenix? All of it. I studied him, searching for hidden motives. There were none. Just exhaustion. And something close to sincerity. Fine, I said. But we start small. The next morning, I drove him to Cedar Brew. He hadn't been in a place like that in decades. He hesitated at the threshold, as if the worn brick and soft jazz were foreign territory. The regulars barely noticed him, too busy with their morning rituals. "This is where it started?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, tying on my old apron. "Where I learned how people actually live." He watched as I greeted Betty, helped her carry a tray, and wiped down the counter. The simple motions felt grounding, almost sacred. After a while, he sat at a corner booth, quietly observing. When I handed him a mug, he looked down at it as though it were something fragile. "I don't remember the last time I poured my own coffee," he said. "That's the problem," I replied. "You spent so long building towers that you forgot what it feels like to stand on the ground." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why they all fell." For an hour we sat there talking, not about money, not about mergers, not about legacy, about people, about purpose, about how the world looks different when you stop staring down from the top. At one point, Betty came over. "Mr. Reed, can I get you a slice of pie on the house?" He smiled at her. A real smile. "No, thank you. But that's kind of you." After she left, he looked at me. "You built something that matters, Samantha. Not just profitable human." I shrugged. "It's not just me. I surrounded myself with people who believed when no one else did." He was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "I want to learn from them. From you." I looked at him, unsure if he was serious. "You learn." He laughed. "I suppose I deserve that too." That afternoon, we stayed through the lunch rush. I introduced him to the staff, to Ava, to the young barista who was saving up for college. He listened, really listened. When we left, the sky had turned soft gold, the light stretching across the street. In the car, he stopped. "You know, for years I thought success was measured in square footage and market value. But this," he gestured toward the cafe, "this feels more permanent." I smiled faintly. "Because it's built on people, not walls." He nodded. "You were right all along." "I didn't need to be right," I said quietly. "I just needed to be seen." He looked at me then, not as the daughter he'd tried to mold, but as the woman who'd become everything he never imagined. "I see you now," he said. And for the first time, I believed him. That night, after I dropped him off, I sat in my car for a long time, hands still on the steering wheel, heart too full to move. Outside, the world kept going, the hum of traffic, the glow of signs, the quiet rhythm of life. For years, I'd been chasing justice. Now I'd found something harder, something rarer. Grace. I whispered into the dark. Maybe this is how you season the earth after the fire. Then I poured myself one last cup of coffee, strong, bitter, and honest. It tasted like the quiet before a different kind of dawn. The morning came gray and quiet, the simple, unvarnished dawn of a working day. I was already at Cedar Brew by 5, sleeves rolled up apron, tied, the scent of roasted beans clinging to the air like an old memory. When the door opened, my father stood there, awkward, in jeans and an old jacket that looked borrowed from another lifetime. "You're early," I said, checking the clock. He shifted on his feet. "You said 5. I didn't want to be late." "Good," I replied, handing him an apron. "Because today you're working." He looked down at the faded blue fabric, hesitating before tying it around his waist. The man who once wore Italian suits now fumbled with a string apron, the silk knot of his former life replaced by faded cotton. "Where do I start?" he asked. "Coffee first. Always coffee." Betty arrived a few minutes later, eyebrows arching when she saw him. "Well, I'll be," she said, laughing softly. "Didn't think I'd see the great Edward Reed behind a counter." He offered a polite smile. "Guess there's a first time for everything. Make sure you wipe the counter before the rush," she teased. "And don't mix up oat milk with regular like Jason did last week, or you'll have a riot on your hands." He nodded solemnly. "Noted." The first hour passed slowly. I showed him how to grind the beans, how to steam the milk without burning it, and how to smile even when someone barked an order without eye contact. He listened carefully, following every instruction like a student eager not to fail. At one point, he looked up from the espresso machine and said quietly, "I used to think this was simple work." And now, he pressed the portafilter in place and met my gaze. "Now I see it's the foundation for everything else." I dipped my chin slightly. "That's the point." By 7, the shop was full, the usual choreography of regulars with laptops and notebooks, all chasing their own urgent quiet. The delivery drivers grabbing quick coffees before their routes, the nurse who always ordered 2 lattes, one for herself and one for whoever worked the night shift. My father moved among them cautiously, carrying drinks, wiping tables, learning faces and names. At first, people stared, recognizing him from headlines and glossy magazine covers. But then something shifted. The curiosity faded, replaced by warmth. He was just another person serving coffee. A young boy spilled his drink, and before I could react, Dad was already kneeling, cleaning it up with napkins. The boy's mother stammered apologies, but he waved them off. "It's all right. Happens to all of us." When he stood again, the weight of his past seemed to have transferred to the wet napkin he held. There was a strange calm in his expression, a softness I hadn't seen in years. "Feels good," he said quietly. "To be useful again." I nodded, resting my hands on the counter. "Welcome to the ground floor." Around noon, when the rush finally thinned, we sat by the window with sandwiches Betty had made. Outside, the street buzzed with life, people moving fast, chasing something just as I once had. Dad took a long sip of coffee. "You know," he said, "when I first started Reed Capital, I thought I was building something permanent. I thought power made you untouchable." "It never does," I said. "You just stop noticing how fragile everything is." He leaned his head against the window pane. I didn't understand what mattered until I lost it. I looked at him. "And what matters now?" He met my eyes. "People, integrity, the ones who show up even when there's nothing to gain." There it was, the answer I'd been waiting to hear for years. Later that day, I brought him to the warehouse that had become our operations hub for BrewLink's new sustainability initiative. Rows of burlap sacks filled the air with the scent of earth and cocoa. Workers moved in practiced rhythm, sorting packing and laughing. Dad stood in silence for a long time, watching them. "You know every name here, don't you?" "Most of them," I said. "That's the rule. If I don't know the people who build it, I don't deserve to run it." He offered a faint smile. "That's leadership, not management." We walked the floor together, talking to employees, checking shipments. When one worker, a single mother named Alina, mentioned she couldn't afford childcare during weekend shifts, I took out my phone and made a note. Dad noticed. "You actually fix things when you hear them. Otherwise, what's the point of listening?" He chuckled softly. "I spent decades in rooms full of people talking, but no one ever listening. Maybe that's why we failed." That evening back at the cafe, we closed early. The two of us sat in silence, the lights dimmed, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Dad turned the empty mug in his hands. "When I first called you a disappointment," he said, voice rough, "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you to waste your potential. I just didn't understand that you were building something I couldn't even see." I looked at him, my throat tightening. "You wanted control, not protection." He inclined his head. "You're right. I was wrong. About everything." The words hung there, simple, fragile, real. "I don't need an apology," I said quietly. "I just need you to stop pretending you have all the answers." He exhaled almost a laugh. "That I can promise." Before he left, he turned back at the door. "You know, Samantha, I thought success was about how high you could climb. You've shown me it's about how deep your roots go." I smiled. "Roots don't look glamorous, but they hold everything together." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time I start growing mine." When the door closed behind him, I stood for a long time staring at the empty chair he'd left behind. For the first time, the emptiness didn't ache. It felt like space opened, possible, alive. Later that night, I sat in my office above the cafe looking down at the city lights. Marcus called to update me on a new partnership proposal. Ava texted a reminder about next week's awards ceremony. But I couldn't focus on any of it. I kept thinking about my father tying that apron, fumbling with the strings. About the way he'd smiled when he poured coffee for a stranger. About how for one day he'd stopped being a man who owned everything and started being someone who understood something. I picked up my phone, Opened a new message and typed slowly, "Dad, shift starts again at 5 tomorrow. Bring gloves. The floor gets cold." Then I hit send. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was rebuilding a family. I felt like we were starting one. The invitation came by courier, heavy paper gold trim, my father's handwriting scrawled across the front, family dinner. One last time. I almost threw it away. But something stopped me. Maybe curiosity. Maybe closure. 3 nights later, I stood outside my parents' house for the first time in years. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The manicured hedges were overgrown. The windows glowed softly like a screen left on after the user has left the room. When I walked in, silence greeted me. No servants, no clinking of glasses, no polished laughter echoing through the halls. Just my family, my father at the head of the table, my mother beside him, and my brother Ryan staring down at his untouched plate. "Sam," my mother said softly, her voice lined with exhaustion. "You came." I wasn't sure I would. I admitted, hanging my coat. "But here I am." My father stood. "Then let's not waste time pretending. We all know why we're here." He gestured to the table. Dinner was simple roast chicken salad and bread. No crystal, no imported wine. Just food. Real food. I sat down. "You wanted a family dinner," I said. "So talk." He took a deep breath. "I asked you here because we've reached the end of something. The firm, the wealth, the facade. It's all gone. And maybe that's the best thing that could have happened to us." My mother flinched but didn't argue. Ryan finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face pale. "Do you know what it's like?" he said quietly, "to be recognized only for your failure? Every news outlet dragging your name through the mud. Every investor who used to call now pretending they never knew you." "Yes," I said evenly. "I know exactly what that's like." He met my gaze for a moment, then dropped it again. "I deserve that." My father placed a hand on the table. "We all do." For a long time, no one spoke. The air felt thick, dense with years of unsaid history. Then my mother broke it. "I've been replaying every word I ever said to you," she told me, voice trembling. "Every time I made you feel small. Every time I measured your worth by what you owned instead of who you were. And I hate myself for it." I studied her face. For once she wasn't hiding behind powder or posture. Her hands shook. She looked human, vulnerable. "You don't have to hate yourself," I said softly. "You just have to do better, for whatever time is left." Her lips quivered into something like a smile. "I can start there." Ryan pushed his plate away. I lost everything he said. The company, the house, the friends who used to depend on my money, but the worst part wasn't losing it, it was realizing how hollow I was without it. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. He went on, his voice breaking. "When I saw you at the cafe, when I saw how people looked at you, not because they feared you, but because they respected you, it hit me. You didn't just build a company. You built a life." He wiped his eyes, embarrassed. "I don't know if I can ever do that. But I want to try." I reached for the pitcher of water, pouring some into his glass. "Then start small," I said. "Start by showing up." He nodded, silent gratitude flickering in his expression. My father leaned back, folding his hands. "Samantha," he said quietly, "you once told me success without integrity collapses. You were right. I built towers made of glass, and you built something rooted in people. I see that now." "I didn't build it to prove you wrong," I said. "I built it because I had to prove to myself that I was more than what you made me believe." He nodded slowly. "And I'm proud of you. I wish I'd said that when it mattered." The words landed softly, filling a space in my chest I hadn't realized was empty. "You still can," I said. "You're saying it now." Dinner ended quietly. No toasts, no speeches. Just the simple sounds of plates being cleared and forks scraping against china. When I stood to leave, my mother reached across the table, catching my hand. "Don't be a stranger," she said. "We don't have much left to offer except time." I squeezed her hand gently. That's the one thing I always wanted. Ryan followed me outside. The night air was cool, the moon pale and distant. I'm thinking about getting out of the city, he said. Something small. Maybe start a local business like you did. Build from the ground up. I smiled faintly. You'll hate it at first. He chuckled. Probably. But if you mean it, I said, call me when you find a place. I'll help. He looked at me surprised. After everything I did, I shrugged. We're still family. Just rebuilding differently. He smiled, a real one this time. Then I'll hold you to that. As I walked to my car, I saw my father standing at the window watching. When our eyes met, he raised a hand not in command but in acknowledgement. I nodded back. Driving away, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time, the word family didn't feel like a wound. It felt like soil, not perfect, but finally fertile. The next morning, I arrived at Cedar Brew early. The air smelled of cinnamon and roasted beans. The sunlight spilled across the floor in quiet gold. Betty was already there, humming as she wiped down the counter. You look lighter today, she said. I had dinner with my family, I replied. She paused mid-wipe. And you survived? More than that, I said, smiling. I think we all did. Ava came in soon after holding a stack of newspapers. You made the front page again, she said. Phoenix Consolidated named one of the top ethical companies of the year. They're calling it The Rise of Purposeful Power. I took the paper, scanned the headline, then set it aside. Good. But that's not the story that matters. What is this one, I said, gesturing around the cafe, the regulars, the laughter, the smell of coffee, the quiet pulse of real life. This is what lasts. When I stepped outside a few minutes later, the city was waking up, buses roaring, shop doors opening light, climbing the glass towers I no longer feared. I thought about my family, each of them in their separate corners, rebuilding, learning, maybe even healing. And I thought about what it meant to start over. Not from revenge, not from ambition, but from understanding. Sometimes you don't need to win the war. You just need to stop fighting. I looked up at the skyline that once felt like an enemy and whispered, "The reckoning is over." Then I walked back inside and poured the first cup of the day. The morning of the Harvest Gala felt strangely calm. The turmoil had finally settled into quiet air. I stood in front of the tall glass windows of my office, watching the city stretch beneath the golden haze of dawn. The skyline that once felt so distant now felt like an extension of my story, every building, every corner, a reminder of where I'd been and who I'd become. In a few hours, I would be standing on stage to receive an award for Entrepreneur of the Year, an honor I'd never sought but somehow earned. But that wasn't what stayed on my mind. What lingered was the quiet realization that the things I once thought I wanted, validation, recognition, revenge, had faded into something simpler, peace. Ava knocked softly on the door. "Car's ready when you are," she said. "The governor's people called to confirm your seat at the front table." "Tell them I'll sit wherever there's space," I said. She smiled. "You know they'll hate that. Then they'll survive." As we drove through downtown, the world around me shimmered with movement. Street vendors set up stalls. Joggers passed by and baristas unlocked cafes that smelled of promise and fresh beginnings. It felt fitting. 4 years ago, I was one of them, serving coffee, taking orders, smiling through exhaustion. Back then, I thought invisibility was a curse. Now I understood it had been a gift. It let me build quietly, without interference, without expectation. When we arrived at the event hall, the buzz of cameras and murmured conversations filled the air. The crowd was a blend of tech founders, investors, politicians, and a few journalists, pretending not to eavesdrop. Marcus was already there, scanning through his phone. "Are you ready?" he asked. "As ready as anyone can be for a night like this," he grinned. "You know what they're calling you in the press now, the waitress who built an empire." I laughed. "They always need a headline." "Yeah," he said, pocketing his phone. "But this time you wrote it yourself." The gala was all polished speeches and rehearsed applause, but when they finally called my name, the noise faded into a kind of slow, suspended silence. I walked to the stage under the warm glare of the spotlights, my heart steady, carrying the weight of the moment with ease. The host handed me the award, a sleek minimalist sculpture heavy and cool in my hands. I stood there for a moment looking out at the audience. Faces blurred into one another, an indistinct wall of black tie and expensive hope. But in the front row I saw them, my parents sitting together and Ryan beside them. My father looked older but peaceful. My mother's hands were clasped in her lap, her expression soft. And Ryan, he was smiling, not the forced grin of our childhood dinners, but a quiet, genuine smile. When I finally spoke, my voice carried clearer than I expected. People often ask how I built my company. They expect a story about innovation strategy or capital. But the truth is simpler. I built it because no one believed I could. And when no one believes in you, you learn to believe in yourself twice as hard. The room was silent. Cameras flashed, but I didn't look at them. My eyes stayed on the three people who once defined my worth. I grew up in a family where success was measured in dollars and last names. I continued. And for a long time I thought that meant I didn't belong. But I've learned something along the way. Worth isn't given by others. It's built by what you do when they stop watching. I took a breath. Let the quiet stretch. So this award isn't for the woman on magazine covers. It's for the waitress who refused to stop trying. The worth isn't found at the top of a skyscraper. It's built on the ground floor when no one is watching. Applause rose scattered at first, then swelling until it filled the hall. But it wasn't the sound that moved me. It was the stillness inside myself, the certainty that I had nothing left to prove. After the ceremony, people crowded around with congratulations, business cards, and proposals. I smiled, shook hands, listened politely, but my mind was elsewhere. When the noise became too much, I slipped outside onto the balcony. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Below, the city pulsed with life. "Escaping your own party," a voice said behind me. I turned. My father stepped out, adjusting his tie, a small smile playing on his lips. "Guess I learned it from you," I said. He chuckled softly. "You were always better at making an exit." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the lights ripple across the buildings. "You spoke beautifully," he said after a while. "Your mother cried." I saw. He turned to face me. "I used to think I understood power. Turns out I only understood control. You taught me the difference." I smiled faintly. "You taught me resilience. Maybe we're even." He nodded, his eyes glassy in the low light. "You've done something extraordinary, Sam. Not just the company, but the way you lead. The way you see people. Seeing people is the easy part," I said quietly. "Believing they matter, that's the real work." When he left, I lingered on the balcony, the city spread out like a map of every mistake and every miracle. My phone buzzed with messages, a routine chorus of congratulations, but one caught my eye. It was from Betty. "Still got your old apron here. Thought you might want it back. B." I smiled, replying, "Keep it. It belongs there more than anywhere else." Then I slipped my phone into my bag and walked down the marble steps into the night. Cedar Brew was quiet when I arrived. The evening crowd had gone, leaving only the hum of the lights and the faint smell of cinnamon. I walked behind the counter, tracing my fingers along the wood worn smooth by years of service. In the back, the old corkboard still hung on the wall, cluttered with Polaroids. Smiling employees, customers holding mugs, kids who had grown up coming here. One photo caught my eye, me years ago in my apron hair tied back, laughing at something out of frame. I remembered that day. Betty had just spilled an entire pot of coffee, and we couldn't stop laughing even as we cleaned it up. That version of me didn't know what was coming, didn't know how betrayal, ambition, or justice would shape her. But she had heart, and that was enough. I made one last cup of coffee and sat at the corner booth where it all began. The world outside moved on, cars passing, lights flickering, stories unfolding. I thought about my family, about the company, about the countless people whose paths had crossed mine. Each of them had left a mark, a lesson, a scar. I took a sip of coffee and whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life itself. The bell above the door jingled softly, and I looked up to see Betty walking in coat draped over her arm. Figured I'd find you here, she said. You couldn't sleep either, she smiled, sliding into the booth. You never really stop showing up, do you? I shrugged. Maybe this is the work, remembering where you started. She reached across the table, patting my hand. Don't ever lose that. It's what makes you different. I won't, I promised. We sat there until the sky turned from black to gray to gold. As the first customers trickled in, I stood, straightened my jacket, and glanced once more around the cafe that had given me everything. Betty called out as I reached the door. See you tomorrow, boss, I grinned. Always. Stepping outside, I breathed in the morning air, cool, bright, alive. Once this city had been my battlefield. Now it was my home. And as the sun climbed higher, I knew the story wasn't ending. It was beginning again, just quieter, steadier, more human, because revenge had burned away long ago. What remained was purpose, and purpose lasts. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or told you weren't enough, remember this? Your worth isn't measured by who sees it. It's built by how you rise. If my story made you feel that even for a moment, share it. Leave your thoughts below and let's keep this circle growing. Because sometimes the quietest revenge is living a life that speaks for itself.